I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, when I heard my husband say 5 words that ended my marriage before I even knew it had started falling apart. She won't find out anyway. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, in the dark, listening to my husband and his mother plan out the rest of my life, like I was a line item in a budget they were finally ready to cut. If you've ever discovered that the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones drawing the knife, stay until the end. Because what I did next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was patient, and it destroyed everything they thought they'd already won. My name is Elena Reyes, and this is the story of how my family tried to erase me, and how I made sure they'd never forget my name again. 3 years earlier, I married a man named Julian Cross, believing I had found the safest person on earth. He was charming in the way that made strangers trust him instantly. Warm eyes, an easy laugh, the kind of attentiveness that felt like being chosen. I was 29, running my own small architecture firm out of a converted studio above a bakery, and for the first time in my adult life, I let myself believe that someone could love me without wanting something from me. I was wrong. I just didn't know it yet. Julian's mother, Vivian, made her feelings about me clear from the very first dinner. She looked at my hands, calloused from years of drafting tables and site visits, and asked, in front of the entire table, whether I planned to keep working like that after the wedding. Like my career was a phase she expected me to grow out of. I smiled. I let it go. That became a pattern I would repeat for the next 3 years. When our son, Milo, was born, I stepped back from the firm to be home with him. It was supposed to be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. Vivian made sure it became permanent, offering to help in ways that always ended with her controlling the house, the schedule, and eventually, without my noticing, the money. I told myself it was normal. New mothers sacrifice things. Families adjust. I told myself a lot of things that year. I had no idea that while I was folding onesies and reheating bottles at 2 a.m., my husband and his mother had already started drawing up a version of my future that didn't include me having a say in it. The first crack came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day you don't remember until you're forced to. Milo had a fever that wouldn't break, and Julian had told me that morning he'd be stuck in back-to-back meetings until 9. So when I drove past his office building to pick up a prescription and saw his car parked 3 blocks away, outside a restaurant he'd never once mentioned, something in my chest went cold before my brain even caught up. I told myself it could be anything. A client lunch, a co-worker's birthday. I told myself that right up until I looked through the window and saw him laughing with a woman who was sitting close enough that their knees were touching under the table. Her name, I would later learn, was Priya. She worked in his firm's business development department, and based on the way she reached over and wiped a crumb from the corner of his mouth, like it was something she'd done 100 times before, this wasn't the first lunch. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I needed to be sure. I told myself a lot of careful, rational things, while my hand shook so badly I could barely hold Milo's medicine dropper steady. What I didn't know yet was that the affair wasn't even the real threat. It was the smallest piece of what was coming. I confronted Julian 3 days later, after I quietly asked a friend to verify what I already knew in my gut. He didn't deny it for long. He cried. He said it had just happened. He said Priya meant nothing, that he'd already ended it, that he couldn't imagine his life without Milo and me in it. And God help me, I believed him. Or maybe I just needed to believe him, because the alternative meant admitting I'd built my entire adult life on a foundation that was never solid to begin with. For a few weeks, he tried. He came home earlier. He helped with Milo. He even stood up to his mother for the first time in 3 years, when she cornered me in the kitchen about dinner being late. I started to think we might actually survive this. I was wrong again. And this time, the truth would come from somewhere I never expected. My own father. My father, Marcus, had spent 40 years building a modest logistics company from a single delivery truck into a regional freight business worth several $1,000,000. He'd never remarried after my mother passed, and he had exactly one heir. Me. He called one Sunday afternoon, his voice lighter than I'd heard it in years. A national shipping conglomerate wanted to acquire the company. The offer, he said, was substantial enough to change everything for our family. I was thrilled for him. Genuinely, Uncomplicated happiness, the first I'd felt in months. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. Julian already asked me about the timeline for the sale. Twice. I laughed it off on the phone. But that night, lying awake next to a husband I'd forgiven for something I thought was the worst thing he'd ever do to me, I started replaying every strange, small thing from the past few months. The sudden interest in my father's health. The offhand comments about family security. The way Vivian had started asking about my father's company at every single dinner, wrapped in compliments so smooth I hadn't noticed the hooks underneath. I didn't have proof of anything yet, but for the first time, I understood that Priya might not have been the only secret in my marriage. The second betrayal didn't come as a confrontation. It came as a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. Milo had woken up crying, and after I got him back to sleep, I went downstairs for water and heard voices coming from the back porch. Julian and Vivian. Low, careful. The way people talk when they think every door in the house is closed. She won't find out anyway, Julian said. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Once your father-in-law signs off on the sale, Vivian continued, you make sure the funds route through the joint account before Elena even knows the number. Then it doesn't matter what she decides later. It's already ours. My husband, planning, with his mother, to divert my father's life's work, money my father intended for me, into an account I wouldn't control, before I even knew the sale had closed. I stood frozen in my own hallway, one hand on the banister, feeling something inside me go very quiet and very still. Not sadness, something colder than that, because in that moment, I finally understood. Priya wasn't a mistake born of temptation. She was a distraction, a convenient storm to keep me emotionally exhausted while the real theft was engineered behind my back. I walked back upstairs without making a sound, and I made a decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. I wasn't going to confront them. I was going to let them believe they'd already won. The next morning, I made Julian's coffee exactly the way he liked it. I asked about his day. I let Vivian criticize my parenting over breakfast without a single word of pushback. Inside, I was building something else entirely. I opened a private account at a bank 2 towns over, one Julian had never heard of, using a small amount of savings I'd quietly kept from my design work before Milo was born. I started documenting everything, dates, overheard conversations, screenshots of Julian's texts with Priya that I'd copied months earlier and never deleted. I hired a private investigator named Dana Voss, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by a college friend who worked in family law, and asked her to build a full financial picture of my husband's accounts, and of Priya's background as well. What Dana found in the following weeks turned my stomach in ways I hadn't prepared for. Julian had opened a private savings account 4 months after our wedding. He'd been quietly funneling money into it for over 2 years, money that should have gone toward our shared expenses, toward Milo's future, toward the life I thought we were building together. The account held just under $60,000, and Priya wasn't simply a co-worker who'd fallen for a married man. She had done this before, twice, with men whose families had money. Dana's report politely called her financially motivated. I called her something else in my head. The affair had never been about love. It had been reconnaissance. I could have confronted everyone right then. I could have burned it all down in a single furious afternoon. But I thought about Milo. I thought about my father, who had worked 40 years for that company and deserved better than to watch his life's achievement get quietly siphoned away by people who saw him as a payday. I thought about the fact that if I moved too fast, Julian and Vivian would simply adjust their plan and bury the evidence deeper. So instead, I did something that still surprises me when I think back on it. I got patient. I told my father gently that I had some concerns about the timeline of the sale. Nothing specific, just a request to slow down and route any transfer directly to an account only I controlled, one Julian didn't know existed. My father, sharp as ever despite his age, didn't ask too many questions. He simply said, "You tell me what you need, and I'll make it happen." At home, I played the role of the grateful, forgiving wife. I let Julian believe his charm had worked. I let Vivian believe her plan was moving exactly as scheduled. And every single day, I got a little closer to the moment I would take it all back. The unraveling started with a single visit to a shopping plaza I hadn't planned to make. I'd stopped to pick up a gift for Milo's daycare teacher when I saw them through a restaurant window. Julian and Priya, sitting close, her hand resting over his on the table. I felt the same cold wave I'd felt the first time. Except now, it didn't come with tears. It came with a strange, sharpening clarity. Then Priya said something that made my blood freeze in a different way entirely. "I'm pregnant." I didn't hear what Julian said back. I didn't need to. I already understood exactly what this meant for their timeline, and exactly how much more desperate that would make both of them. I walked away before either of them saw me, and that night, for the first time since I had overheard the plan on the porch, I let myself cry. Not for my marriage, which I now understood had been dead for a long time, but for the version of myself who had spent 3 years trying to earn the love of people who had already decided what I was worth to them. Then I wiped my face, and I kept working. Over the following weeks, I noticed something that told me the plan had accelerated. Julian became attentive again, almost aggressively so, bringing home flowers, offering to take Milo to daycare, suggesting we visit my parents to catch up. I understood immediately. He needed my father to trust him completely before the sale closed. He needed to look like the perfect son-in-law, right up until the money moved. I let him think it was working. During our visit, I sat beside my mother while the men talked business in the next room. I heard Julian steer the conversation toward the sale, asking pointed questions about the timeline, the structure of the payout, whether it would be a lump sum or staggered. My father, who I had already quietly briefed, gave him nothing but vague, pleasant non-answers. On the drive home, Julian was unusually quiet. I could see the tension in his jaw, the calculation behind his eyes. He was running out of time, and he knew it. What he didn't know was that Dana's investigation was complete. What he didn't know was that I had already spoken to a divorce attorney named Adrian Cole, a calm, precise man who had represented my college roommate through her own difficult separation years earlier. What he didn't know was that everything, the affair, the hidden account, the plan overheard on our own back porch, was documented, dated, and ready. I was no longer the woman standing frozen at the bottom of the stairs. The sale of my father's company closed on a Thursday in late spring. I know this because it's the same day I filed for divorce. I didn't tell Julian in advance. I simply came home that evening, sat him and Vivian down at the same table where I'd once let her humiliate me over dinner, and placed a folder in front of them. "I know about Priya," I said. "I know about the account, and I know exactly what the two of you were planning to do with my father's money." Vivian's face went white. Julian's went through something closer to panic. He tried to deny it at first, the classic reflex of a man who'd never expected to be caught. But Adrian had prepared me well, and I laid it all out with a calm that seemed to unsettle Julian far more than shouting ever would have. The bank records, the screenshots, a recording Dana had helped me legally obtain of a phone call between Julian and Priya discussing the pregnancy and the money coming through. "You'll get nothing," Julian finally said, his voice shaking with rage rather than remorse. "We're married. Whatever's mine is yours, which means whatever's yours is mine too." I almost laughed. "You should have thought about that before you try to route my father's money through an account I don't control. Community property doesn't cover fraud, Julian. It doesn't cover concealment. And it definitely doesn't cover whatever you two were planning to do once the transfer went through." That was when he lunged for the folder, trying to grab it out of my hands. I pulled back instinctively. In the scramble, my foot caught the leg of the chair behind me, and I fell hard, the back of my head striking the corner of the counter. The last thing I heard before the room went dark was Vivian's voice, high and panicked, and Milo crying somewhere upstairs. I don't remember the ambulance. I don't remember the hospital lights, or the hours that must have passed while doctors worked to stop the bleeding in my skull. What I remember is waking up inside a body that no longer answered to me. I could hear everything around me with startling clarity. The beeping monitors, the hushed voices of nurses, the particular rhythm of my father's breathing when he was trying not to fall apart. But I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't move a single finger. I existed, fully conscious, trapped somewhere just beneath the surface of my own skin. The doctors called it a rare post-traumatic state, a kind of consciousness without control, and they told my family there was no way to predict if or when I would wake up. I heard all of it, every word, and I heard something else, too. Something that told me my husband's ambition hadn't slowed down even slightly, even with me lying motionless in a hospital bed. Julian visited exactly once a day, always performing devotion for whichever nurse or family member happened to be in the room. The moment we were alone, his voice changed entirely. "You really did it this time," he murmured one afternoon, close enough that I could smell his cologne. "Perfect, actually. You can't testify. You can't divorce me. And your father's not about to cut off his comatose daughter's husband, is he? All I have to do is wait." I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and put my hands around his throat. Instead, I lay there, furious and utterly powerless, memorizing every word so I could use it later, if there was a later. There was one more voice that came to me during those long, silent days, though. A voice I didn't recognize at first, low and steady, that visited every evening after the nurses finished their rounds. He would gently move my arms and legs to keep the muscles from wasting, and he would talk to me about nothing important, about the weather, about a case he was working on, about how much he hoped I'd wake up soon. He always smelled faintly of cedar and clove, a scent that became, strangely, the only comfort in my long silent days. I didn't know who he was, but somewhere in that darkness, I started listening for him more than I listened for anyone else. 3 weeks in, I began to feel the smallest flickers of control returning. A twitch of a finger, the ability to move my eyes beneath closed lids. I told no one, not the nurses, not my parents, and especially not Julian. I understood, with total clarity, that the moment I let anyone know I was recovering, Julian would find a way to make sure I never got the chance to speak. So I trained myself in secret. Every night, after visiting hours ended, I focused every ounce of will I had into moving one muscle at a time. A finger, a wrist, the corner of my mouth. It was agonizingly slow, but it was mine, and for the first time since my wedding day, I was building something entirely on my own terms. Then, one evening, Julian arrived with news that changed everything. "Your father finalized the transfer today," he said, leaning close, his voice thick with barely contained excitement. "Half the proceeds are moving into our joint account by Friday. You should be proud of yourself, Elena. Even lying here, you're finally useful." He laughed. It was a small, private laugh, the kind reserved for a joke only he found funny. I would have given anything, in that moment, to open my eyes and watch his face when I told him exactly how wrong he was. Friday arrived, and with it, my parents. I could hear them enter the room, could hear Julian's voice shift instantly into the warm, dutiful tone he reserved for an audience. "I'm just helping keep her comfortable," he said, and I felt his hand on mine, performing tenderness for the people he was actively robbing. Then I heard my father's voice, steady but heavy with emotion. "Elena, I'm finalizing the transfer today. Half goes to you and Julian, like we discussed. I only wish you were awake to see it." This was the moment. If I waited any longer, the money would move, and everything I had spent weeks building toward would collapse into nothing. I opened my eyes. The room went silent so completely I could hear my own heartbeat on the monitor beside me. My mother gasped and rushed to my side, her hands shaking as she gripped mine. My father froze mid-sentence, tears already forming. Julian recovered fastest of anyone, plastering on a look of relief that didn't reach his eyes. "Elena," he said, "thank God you're awake." I turned my head, slowly, deliberately, until I was looking directly at him. "Don't transfer anything," I said, my voice hoarse but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Dad, cancel the transfer. Now." My father, stunned, asked the question I knew was coming. "Elena, what's going on?" I told them everything. The affair, the hidden account, the conversation I'd overheard on our own back porch, the one that started this entire nightmare. The words Julian had whispered to me every single day. I lay there unable to respond, believing I would never be able to repeat them. Julian's face went through disbelief, then fury, then something close to desperation as he realized the story he'd built for months was collapsing in real time. "She's lying," he said too loudly, too fast. "She hit her head. She doesn't know what she's saying." But my father had already turned to the attorney, standing quietly by the door, a woman I'd asked to be present that day, just in case. Adrian's associate had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Cancel it," my father said, his voice flat and final. "All of it." That was when Julian's composure finally broke entirely. He lunged toward the bedside table, grabbing the only sharp object in reach, a small pair of medical scissors left from a dressing change, and pressed them against my arm, his voice cracking with the specific panic of a man watching every plan he'd ever made disintegrate at once. "You don't get to ruin this," he said. "Not after everything." My mother screamed. My father lurched forward, and for one terrifying moment, the room dissolved into chaos. Then the door opened. The man who stepped through the door moved fast enough that Julian barely had time to react. He caught Julian's wrist mid-motion, twisted it sharply enough to force the scissors from his grip, and shoved him back against the wall with a controlled, practiced force that told me this wasn't the first difficult moment he'd handled in his life. Security arrived seconds later, and Julian was restrained, shouting accusations that no one in the room believed anymore. I turned toward the man who had intervened, and for the first time since I'd woken up, I recognized the scent that had comforted me through every dark, silent night. Cedar and clove. It was Adrian Cole, my divorce attorney, the man who had spent every evening for the past month sitting beside my hospital bed, talking to me, moving my arms and legs so my muscles wouldn't waste away, telling me quietly that I had a lot of things left to do. He hadn't just been managing my case from a distance. He had been showing up, night after night, for a client who couldn't even acknowledge he was there. "You knew I might wake up," I said, once the room had cleared enough to speak. "I hoped you would," he said. "Every single day." Julian was arrested that afternoon, facing charges that ranged from fraud to assault. The recording Dana had helped me obtain, combined with what he'd said aloud in that hospital room in front of my parents, an attorney, and hospital staff, made the case against him nearly impossible to fight. At trial, months later, the full picture came out. The hidden account, the years of quiet financial extraction, the plan he and Vivian had built, piece by piece, to rout my father's company's sale away from me entirely. Priya testified as well, though not by choice. Her own financial history with 2 previous relationships came out in ugly, humiliating detail, and any sympathy the jury might have had for her evaporated entirely. Julian was sentenced to 11 years. Vivian, though she avoided criminal charges, lost any relationship she once had with her grandson, a consequence I never had to enforce. She simply stopped being welcome in a life she'd spent years trying to control. My father's company sale was restructured entirely in my name. Milo's future was protected in a trust no one but me could touch. And for the first time in 3 years, I stood in a courtroom not as someone's wife, not as someone's disappointment, but as the only person who had ever fully controlled her own story. It's been 2 years since that hospital room. Milo is older now, loud and curious, and utterly unaware of how close his mother came to losing everything without ever knowing it was happening. Adrian and I didn't rush anything. There was too much healing to do first, too many nights of quiet conversation to have while I relearned what it felt like to trust someone without checking every word for a hidden motive. But he was patient in exactly the way the rest of my life had never been, and slowly, carefully, something real grew in the space where my old marriage used to be. Last spring, he asked me to marry him in the same quiet, steady voice I remembered from every dark night in that hospital room. I said yes before he even finished the question. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. The people who plan your future without asking you rarely expect you to be paying attention. They mistake your silence for surrender. They mistake your patience for weakness. I let them believe that for exactly as long as I needed to. And when I finally spoke, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't rushed. It was simply true. And the truth, when you've been carrying it in silence for long enough, is the loudest thing in the room.